At the end of World War II, Berlin lay in ruins, its streets full of rubble and its future deeply uncertain. The victorious Allies divided both Germany and its capital into zones, promising stability, but also drawing new lines. In the middle of shattered buildings, a new kind of conflict was quietly starting. As tension grew between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, Berlin became a strange island. West Berlin sat deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone, like a pocket of one system inside another. What had been a single city slowly turned into the sharpest edge of the Cold War. In 1948, the Soviet Union tried to squeeze the western sectors by blocking land routes to West Berlin. In response, Western planes began landing one after another, bringing food, coal, and supplies through the air. For Berliners, the roar of engines overhead turned into a sound of hope rather than fear. Over the 1950s, West and East Germany moved in different directions. West Berlin filled with new shops, neon lights, and pop music, while East Berlin developed state-owned factories, strict planning, and political slogans. The same streets that once just led across town now crossed an invisible border between systems. As years passed, hundreds of thousands of East Germans used Berlin's open border to move west. Some sought better pay, others more freedom, and some simply wanted to join family they felt cut off from. Each departure left a gap in the East German workforce and a deeper worry in its leaders. By the early 1960s, East German and Soviet leaders viewed the constant flow of people leaving as a serious danger. In back rooms and secret meetings, they discussed tougher measures to stop it. Eventually, they chose the harshest option of all, sealing the border inside Berlin. On the night of August 13, 1961, East German forces rolled out barbed wire and barricades across Berlin, while most people slept. By morning, stunned residents woke to find streets, tram lines, and even family connections suddenly cut. For many, it felt like the city had turned into a maze with new walls they had never agreed to. In the weeks and months after that night, the temporary barriers hardened. Barbed wire gave way to concrete slabs, higher fences, and patrol roads. The wall was no longer just a surprise line of metal. It became a long, layered system designed to make escape nearly impossible. The wall did not just slice maps, it sliced relationships. Some people now waved to siblings from windows across no man's land, while others looked at sealed doorways where streets once continued. A city that had already suffered bombings now felt like it had been deliberately broken again. Very quickly, the Berlin Wall became more than just a local barrier. For people around the world, it stood for the whole Cold War division between East and West. Every photo of concrete and watchtowers carried a message about fear, control, and the question of whether the world would ever come together again. Not long after the wall went up, tanks from the United States and the Soviet Union faced each other at a crossing called Checkpoint Charlie. For a tense moment, Berliners wondered if their city might spark a new world war. Then, slowly, the tanks backed away, proving that even violent-looking moments could end in restraint. After the standoffs faded from headlines, Berlin settled into a strange normal. Children grew up playing in parks where a high concrete wall was just part of the landscape, while adults planned visits and birthdays around permits and checkpoints. The wall turned into a daily backdrop, even as it remained a wound. In East Germany, the State Security Service, the Stasi, tried to keep control partly through information. They gathered reports from informants, listened in on conversations, and stored mountains of files. People learned to be careful what they said even at home, never quite sure who might be listening. West Berliners lived in a pocket of capitalism and democracy surrounded by a socialist state. Their city received subsidies, hosted concerts, and became a showcase of bright consumer life. Yet people there also knew that leaving by land meant crossing hostile territory, making their freedom feel both special and fragile. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin and declared, in German, that he too was a Berliner. For many listeners, the speech was a powerful sign that the West would not abandon them. The phrase echoed across the decades as a symbol of solidarity in a divided city. In 1968, reformers in Czechoslovakia tried to create a socialism with a human face. Many East Germans watched hopefully, wondering if their own system might soften too. When Soviet tanks rolled in to stop these changes, it sent a clear warning across the Eastern Bloc, including through the streets of East Berlin. In the 1970s, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt pushed a policy called Ostpolitik, seeking practical ties with Eastern neighbors. Treaties recognized borders, improved travel in some cases, and encouraged more human contact. The wall did not vanish, but it became slightly less of a total dead end. Even with the wall in place, some people still tried to flee. They dug tunnels under streets, hid in car trunks, or flew improvised hot air balloons. Every escape story mixed bravery with danger and reminded everyone that the wall had never convinced all minds, only blocked bodies. Beyond Berlin, the Cold War rumbled on with conflicts, arms races, and eventually periods of negotiation called détente. Missiles in silos and submarines, proxy wars, and summit meetings all formed a larger backdrop to the wall's story. The city was one stage in a much bigger play between superpowers. In 1975, many countries signed agreements in Helsinki that, among other things, mentioned human rights and freedoms. Activists in Eastern Europe quietly took those words seriously, using them to question censorship and repression. On paper, nothing changed in Berlin overnight, but a new vocabulary for complaining had entered the system. By the late 1970s, the wall seemed permanent from a distance. Yet beneath the surface, economic troubles, human rights talk, and quiet resistance had begun to erode faith in the system that maintained it. The concrete still stood, but its story was starting to wobble. At the end of the 1970s, new crises and an arms buildup pushed the Cold War into another cold phase. Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, and new missiles appeared on maps of Europe. Berliners once again felt their city was perched near a dangerous edge, even if the wall itself did not move. In 1981, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States, promising to be firm against the Soviet Union. His speeches were dramatic, and his administration increased military spending. To some, he seemed like a hardline Cold Warrior. To others, he later became a partner in reducing weapons. While the West poured money into new projects, East Germany faced aging factories, debt, and shortages. Shop shelves often looked thin, and people waited in lines for basic goods, even as official propaganda claimed everything was fine. The gap between the promised future and the lived reality widened. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union. He faced a huge empire with economic problems and a tired political system. Rather than simply tighten control, he began to speak about reform, hoping to save the system by changing it. Gorbachev introduced two key terms: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. People in the Soviet Union were suddenly allowed to talk more openly about problems, and some economic reforms loosened central control. These ideas flowed outward, inspiring citizens in other Eastern Bloc countries too. Unlike Gorbachev, many East German leaders wanted to keep things as they were. They dismissed the need for glasnost and perestroika, arguing that their state was already successful. But their stubbornness made the system feel more and more out of touch with the society it claimed to represent. In 1987, Reagan spoke at the Brandenburg Gate, directly challenging the Soviet leader with the famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The sentence sounded bold and theatrical, echoing across the square and through international media. At the time, many people doubted it would actually happen, but the phrase stuck. At the same time, Reagan and Gorbachev worked on real arms control treaties, including an agreement that removed certain nuclear missiles from Europe. These talks did not touch the wall directly, but they lowered the temperature of the Cold War. Fewer missiles aimed at each other made dramatic changes in Europe easier to imagine. In East German living rooms, people watched these summits on carefully edited news reports. Still, they could sense that something in the international climate was shifting. If the superpowers were pulling back from the brink, perhaps ordinary citizens could press more boldly for change at home. By the late 1980s, official slogans about the wall as an anti-fascist protective barrier sounded increasingly hollow. Younger East Germans wanted travel, open discussion, and better living standards, not just security stories from the past. The distance between official language and everyday conversation grew into a quiet rebellion. As the 1980s neared their end, East German leaders felt squeezed. Their Soviet patron urged reform, their citizens pushed for change, and their economy sagged. The wall still towered over Berlin, but the forces acting on it were stronger than ever before. In neighboring Poland, a workers' movement called Solidarity challenged the communist government. After years of tension, talks led to partially free elections in 1989, and Solidarity won big. For East Germans, this was proof that even in a socialist state, change could come from organized citizens. That same year, Hungary began cutting its border fence with Austria, and later allowed East Germans to cross westward. The Iron Curtain developed its first real gap on the ground. News of this filtered into East Germany, turning quiet grumbling into urgent conversations about leaving. In August 1989, Hungarian and Austrian activists organized a symbolic open-border picnic. Hundreds of East Germans used the event as a chance to slip through, turning a protest into a real escape. Images of families carrying bags through a gap in the fence raced back to East Germany. Back in East Germany and neighboring countries, some citizens rushed to West German embassies, especially in Prague, to seek asylum. Embassies became crowded camping grounds of hope, with families sleeping in hallways and gardens. The sight of so many determined people embarrassed East German leaders. In October 1989, longtime East German leader Erich Honecker was replaced by Egon Krenz. The change came at the top, but it did not satisfy people in the streets. Many saw it as too little, too late, especially as protests were growing instead of shrinking. In Leipzig, people gathered on Monday evenings at the Nikolaikirche for prayers and discussions. From these peaceful church meetings, the first large-scale marches emerged. The words, "We are the people," became a chant, insisting that legitimacy comes from citizens, not just from party offices. Week by week, the Monday demonstrations multiplied. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, filled Leipzig's streets, joined by protests in other cities. People feared a violent crackdown but kept coming anyway, betting that the world was watching. Just months earlier, images from Beijing's Tiananmen Square had shown what a regime could do to stop protests. Many East Germans worried their leaders might order a similar response. But as crowds grew, security forces hesitated, and hard orders to shoot never came. Foreign journalists and East German citizens with hidden cameras documented the marches. Knowing that images could reach the world gave protesters extra courage. It is harder to crack down brutally when every club swing or arrest might appear on the evening news abroad. At home, families argued over what to do. Some wanted to join demonstrations, others feared losing jobs or worse, and a few still trusted the state's warnings. The revolution in East Germany was not just on the streets. It was also in whispered kitchen conversations. As protests expanded, official speeches and newspaper editorials sounded more desperate and less convincing. Even some in the Stasi and party began quietly doubting whether the system could be held together. A government that had once spoken with certainty now stumbled over its own words. By autumn 1989, the combination of foreign examples, domestic protests, and hesitant authorities created a wave that no one person controlled. The question was no longer whether change would come, but how fast and how peacefully. The wall, once unshakable, now stood in the path of this growing tide. Under pressure, East German leaders tried to design new travel rules that would let citizens leave more easily in a controlled way. Committees wrote complicated regulations about visas, conditions, and timing. Few in the room imagined that these dry documents would trigger an immediate rush to the border. On November 9, 1989, the ruling Politburo met to discuss the new rules and broader reforms. They approved a text that allowed more travel, and in theory required some processing. But the wording was unclear, and copies of the decision had to race down hallways and into briefcases. Later that day, party spokesman Günter Schabowski received a copy of the new travel rules before his press conference. He had been busy and skimmed the document quickly, stuffing it among other papers. On stage, that hurried reading would matter a great deal. That evening, Schabowski sat down before a room full of journalists and live cameras. Reporters expected routine announcements, not historic news. The mood at first was calm, even bored, as pens scribbled and tape recorders hummed quietly. When Schabowski mentioned new travel regulations, one Italian reporter asked a crucial follow-up. From when does this apply? Schabowski, flipping through his papers, seemed unsure. After a pause, he answered with words that would soon echo across Berlin. It applies immediately, without delay. East German state television broadcast the press conference that evening. Viewers across the country heard Schabowski's words and interpreted them in the most hopeful way. The border is open now. Phones rang, neighbors shouted down stairwells, and people grabbed coats, unsure but excited. Soon, streams of people began walking and driving toward the main border crossings in Berlin. Many carried only their identification, and maybe a small bag, unsure if they would really be let through. The wall that had kept people away for decades now drew them like a magnet. At posts like Bornholmer Strasse, border guards suddenly faced swelling crowds. They had heard nothing about opening the wall and feared making a mistake. Some tried to send people home, others stamped passports harshly, but the numbers kept rising. The rules technically required checks, approvals, and delays. But outside, thousands chanted, pushed, and pleaded to cross. Guards had to choose between legal procedures and the reality that they could no longer contain the crowd safely or morally. At Bornholmer Strasse, Officer Harold Jaeger and his colleagues finally made a fateful choice. They lifted the barrier and let people through. No clear order had told them to do it, but no one stopped them either. In one instant, years of fear and routine collapsed into a single, brave action. East Berliners poured through the checkpoints into West Berlin, some laughing, some crying, many simply stunned. West Berliners greeted them with flowers, drinks, and applause. For hours, the city's old fault line turned into a meeting place instead of a barrier. News that one crossing had opened spread quickly, and other checkpoints followed. The wall had never been designed to operate with open gates everywhere. In a matter of hours, a system built on separation was riddled with passages. As the night went on, more and more people climbed onto the wall itself. They danced, sang, and helped each other up, turning a place of barbed wire into a festival stage. The very surface that had symbolized fear now echoed with laughter and music. Spontaneous celebrations broke out across Berlin. People popped champagne, drivers honked the horns of their Trabi cars, and strangers embraced on sidewalks. At the same time, many eyes filled with tears as years of bottled-up emotion finally had somewhere to go. In the following days and weeks, people grabbed hammers, chisels, and souvenir-sized tools to chip away at the wall. These amateur demolition crews earned the nickname Mauerspechte, or wall woodpeckers. Each chipped piece of concrete became a tiny, colorful trophy of change. Musicians quickly turned the wall's openings into stages. Impromptu concerts and later big organized shows used sound to celebrate what concrete had once suppressed. Guitars and amplifiers now took over the space once ruled by floodlights and loudspeakers. As the wall opened, many wondered whether Soviet tanks would roll again, as they had in Budapest and Prague. This time, Gorbachev chose not to intervene. His silence and restraint allowed events in East Germany to unfold without a superpower attack. In West Germany, Chancellor Helmut Kohl quickly outlined a 10-point plan for closer cooperation and eventual reunification. The plan moved faster than many expected, turning vague dreams into specific steps. Reunifying a divided country now looked not just emotional but practical. As reunification started to look inevitable, practical questions crowded in. How would currencies be joined? Who would lose jobs as old factories closed? And what would happen to pensions and savings? Joy about the wall's fall mixed with anxiety about the unpredictable future. In July 1990, the two Germanys created a currency union, bringing the West German Deutschmark into the East. People lined up outside banks to exchange their old money for new notes. The feel of fresh bills in their hands made the abstract idea of unity very concrete. On October 3, 1990, East Germany formally joined the Federal Republic of Germany. Flags were raised, speeches delivered, and fireworks launched across the country. For many, it felt like a new birthday for a country that had been split for nearly half a century. Chunks of the Berlin Wall traveled to museums, corporate lobbies, and public squares around the globe. Visitors now stare at these painted slabs as relics of another era. The wall that once kept people in now travels as a warning and a storytelling tool. For those who had lived decades with the wall, its absence brought complex feelings. Many rejoiced at the freedoms gained, while some missed a sense of stability or feared being left behind in the new economy. History had delivered a happy headline, but personal stories stayed nuanced. With the wall open and Germany reunified, the Cold War lost one of its hardest edges. The world still held dangers and disagreements, but the image of concrete slicing a city in two began to fade. The center of the East-West standoff had cracked, and light poured through. Long before celebrations in 1989, many tried to escape across the wall and did not survive. Memorials in Berlin now list their names and tell their stories. Remembering them reminds us that the wall's fall came after real sacrifice. Today, school groups visit the wall's remains to learn how quickly democracies and freedoms can be narrowed. Guides explain how border systems grow step by step, turning lines on paper into fences and watchtowers. The concrete may be thinner, but its lessons remain thick. Not long after the wall fell, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and the Cold War formally ended. Yet new tensions, conflicts, and rivalries appeared in other forms. History did not stop. It simply changed shape, just as the wall changed from barrier to monument. In many parts of the world today, new walls and fences rise for different reasons: security, migration, fear. Berlin's wall has become a reference point whenever people debate whether barriers solve problems or just freeze them. Its story asks us to think carefully before we pour concrete in the name of safety. Former East Germans describe their experiences in varied ways. Some recall oppression and want to celebrate every brick that vanished. Others remember strong communities and feel nostalgia for certain aspects of their old lives. Listening to these voices helps keep the story from becoming too simple. Along the former death strip, bike paths, parks, and sports fields now stretch where guard towers once stood. Children racing along these paths often know the wall only from stories, not from daily fear. Their joy is part of the wall's legacy too. Films, novels, and murals keep the wall's memory alive in culture. Artists paint on remaining sections, directors tell stories of spies and tunnel diggers, and graphic novels explain history to new generations. The wall has become not just a structure, but a creative subject. Our Tiny Titan's storyteller might walk along the former wall line, pointing out how a line that once dictated life is now just a pattern in pavement. With a few gestures, they can show how power, fear, and courage all left marks on this strip of land. The wall becomes less a monster and more a teacher. The fall of the Berlin Wall reminds us that even powerful systems can change under pressure from people and circumstances. It also warns that freedom and unity never appear automatically. They require choices, risks, and often a bit of confusion. Remembering those choices helps us face new walls, visible and invisible, in our own time. Our tiny storytellers remind us that the wall did not fall because of one speech, one leader, or one night. It cracked under the combined weight of world politics, local courage, economic strain, and one confused press conference. When enough people push in many ways, even the thickest concrete can become a memory instead of a prison.